So, Marty, in your long career at the U of M, you were involved in groundbreaking longitudinal research on child maltreatment, both abuse and neglect. So, tell us about that research and some of the key findings you think are most important for people to understand.
Okay. Well, I had the good fortune back in the 1970s, the late 70s, when I was starting work on my doctorate at the University of Minnesota, to get connected to a researcher by the name of Byron Eglund. He was a professor in educational psychology at that time and then went on into the Institute of Child Development, and he started this really groundbreaking longitudinal study, what's called a prospective longitudinal study. That is recruiting pregnant women and their babies, still in utero, and following them forward from the time of this pregnancy up to the present time, actually, and certainly up through the time that these babies were in their 40s when the research was really going strongly. And so I had the good fortune to get connected to that research initially as part of my doctoral studies, and then continued throughout my career at the university to work both on that initial study, which was known as the Minnesota Study of Risk and Adaptation, and then on an intervention study that related to the same professor, Byron Eglund, who worked with me on developing a preventive intervention program for high-risk mothers and babies, and fathers and other family members, but with the women as the point of entry into the family. So that really kind of defined a good portion of my career in my many years at the University of Minnesota. That study was a very interesting design in that all of the pregnant women who were recruited were living in poverty at the time. Many of them had other risk factors as well, a low level of education. Many of them were single. They had all sorts of things that had happened in their lives, including a good number of them who had been abused or neglected in their own childhoods and had experienced domestic violence and other kinds of risk factors. Not all of them had all of those risks by any means, but we were following them because we know that even a lot of young, poor women with limited education and with other risk factors go on to care well for their children. And their children manage to thrive and develop well, and they have good relationships with their parents and other family members. So we wanted to really see what is it that distinguishes between those parents who are living in high-risk circumstances, who care well for their children, versus those who do kind of live out that risk and provide less than optimal care, and in many cases even abuse or neglect those children. So that was the overall design. We also were looking at some other very important questions within that study. One being, what are the long-term consequences of abuse and neglect at every stage of development throughout that long-term design? And what can we learn about breaking intergenerational cycles of maltreatment? Another major question that this longitudinal study addressed had to do with intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect. And we know that many people who are maltreated in their own childhood do, sadly, go on and maltreat their children. You'd think that that would be kind of counterintuitive. You'd want to be so determined to provide good care, but it isn't all that easy. And so our study set out to try to identify the factors that distinguish between those parents in our study who were maltreated in their childhood, but managed to break that cycle, versus the ones who were maltreated and passed it on to that next generation. So that's a very important question, and I'll say a little more about that in a few minutes. You had also asked me, Rich, what were some of the major findings, and I'll focus on one really important piece of information that I think is very relevant to the work that you're doing with Safe Passage. It's that we found that children in the earliest months and years of life suffer particularly damaging consequences when they are maltreated. One of the most important findings from this longitudinal study had to do with the impact of abuse and neglect on children in the earliest months and years of life. And, we really didn't know that much. There hadn't been that much good research that really started very early in a child's life and looked at the differences among different types of maltreatment: physical abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Those are different patterns of maltreatment, but we had a general sense that they really are harmful to kids. But it's hard to measure that, and especially when it happens so early in development. But our study very clearly showed that when children are maltreated in any of those ways in the early months and years of life, the consequences are huge and they're very long-lasting, right on up into adulthood. We found that babies are very unlikely to develop a secure attachment with the parent who's maltreating, and that shouldn't be a surprise, but that means that they're missing that really key foundational piece in human development. We build on those earliest relationships as we grow through the toddler, preschool, and right on up periods of development. So we know that the attachment system is very much affected. We know that children's emotional regulation, how they control impulses, their ability to learn and to think clearly and to pay attention, their empathy, how they're able to feel what other people feel as they get older. All of these kinds of things are shaped by those early experiences of caregiving, and certainly when there's a lack of optimal caregiving or a lack of good enough caregiving, children are really, really harmed. We even know that there's a higher risk of having different kinds of diseases in later life. And of course, the famous ACEs study, which has looked at adverse childhood experiences, is showing that as well. So it's not only our research, but we now understand that maltreatment early in life really affects every aspect of a person's development throughout their life.
Well, you've covered a lot of these topics since the 1980s in books and articles that you've had published about the impact of neglect, physical and emotional, that leaves no visible wounds but can have this devastating lifelong impact. Is there more that you want to say about that lifelong impact?
Yes, and I was speaking about the different kinds of maltreatment that have these long-term effects, but one of the other really big findings from our longitudinal study was that emotional neglect has at least as bad, and in many cases a worse impact on lifelong development as physical abuse. And the thing about emotional neglect is that it's not easily detected by people. And babies can't speak up and say what's happening to them. And so we may not see immediate harm in the child, but we know that there's huge risk for this harm to show up and to accumulate and multiply over time. What that feels like and what that looks like to a baby is in simple things. So babies cry to tell us that they need something from us. But when a baby cries needing comfort or needing to be fed or played with or whatever it might be, and they don't get that response, over time they don't learn to trust that caregiver. They don't learn to trust their own power to solicit what they need. And that just erodes their capacity to trust other people going forward and to care and have positive relationships with other people going forward. We saw in the kids in our study who were emotionally neglected in infancy or very early childhood that they had a dramatic decline on standardized tests of infant and toddler development. From 9 months to 24 months, these kids dropped significantly in terms of their ability to think and perform basic cognitive tasks and problem-solving tasks, which was something that really had not been documented before, as it happens in infancy and going into that toddler period. Over time, these kids were showing lots of behavior problems in childcare, in preschool, in elementary school. By the time this group of kids who were emotionally neglected got to be teenagers, 73% of those children, now teens, qualified for 2 or more psychiatric diagnoses. they met the criteria, the diagnostic criteria for 2 or more mental health diagnoses. That's very significant. And they went on to have difficulty in their intimate relationships and in the workplace as adults.
So, what does it take to stop maltreatment, or better yet, to prevent it in the first place?
Well, those are 2 big questions, and I think the answer to stopping it when it's already occurring and or preventing it before it even happens are very similar, in that we know from a wealth of research, especially over the past 2 or 3 decades, that people need, families need, intervention that is relationship-based, that is grounded in empathy and compassion and understanding, but also holding people accountable. But we need to understand parents and what they're bringing to that equation of the relationship with their child if we're going to make a difference. And so we can't just tell them the right thing to do. We can't just try to give them knowledge or change their immediate behaviors, but we have to really understand them in a much deeper way and help them come to understand themselves. And some of the ingredients of that are definitely building knowledge, particularly knowledge of child development. What does a baby mean when he or she shows separation anxiety? Parents sometimes get very angry. They say, oh, he's just trying to get at me, or, you know, he just is mad that I won't give him everything he wants. Instead of understanding that that's a basic human need, and separation anxiety is actually a positive thing, because it shows that that baby has come to realize you, the parent, are the center of their world at that stage of development. So understanding that is very important. That's just one small, not a small example, that's one big example. Toddler negativism, saying no and showing that I have a mind of my own. That's something that's very annoying for any parent. But if we understand the significance of that in the child's development, to move from being part of this tight little dyad of mother and child or father and child to being an increasingly independent young person who can have a mind of his or her own and do some things independently. If we understand the meaning of that, we're going to be able to deal with it much more effectively. A second thing that is very important is having support for yourself as a parent. Emotional support in particular. It's very hard to be a good enough parent under any circumstances. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's much harder when you don't have a support system for yourself. And a third factor that's really getting to the deepest issues has to do with how you were treated in your own childhood. And I mentioned before the parents who were maltreated as children, and you know how important it is that they get what they need to be able to break that cycle. And so we know that being able to face the pain of what they experienced, being able to reflect on that and understand it, come to think about it in a new way, is what will really help them be able to go on and give their child, their baby, what they were not able to have for themselves. And I can elaborate on that in a few moments.
You're really talking about intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect, and how to
Absolutely.
kind of break that cycle. And I think that's what you're getting into, and maybe can you say some more about how that works?
Yes, and you know, this is it's such a big area of study in academic circles all over the world now, and this has really been a big thrust of the intervention work, the preventive intervention work that I've done going back to the 1980s. In 1986, Byron Eglin, the same professor I referred to before, worked with me to develop what we call the STEEP program, Steps Toward Effective, Enjoyable Parenting. And that program, you know, is similar to many other programs that are operating around the country and in fact around the world now. But ours was one of the very first that was grounded in a deep understanding of attachment theory and research. It was guided by that earlier longitudinal study that really informed how we approach the parents, reaching out to pregnant women again and using the pregnant woman as the point of entry into the family. But what we've learned through now, 1986 to 2020, that's 34 years that we've been doing this program and doing it in different ethnic cultures, doing it in different parts of the world. I do a lot of training of STEEP facilitators in Germany, Australia, Switzerland, German-speaking countries. In Ireland now, they're using it with parents who were in the foster care system themselves as children. And we've seen it used in Australia, New Zealand, lots of other places around the world. But what we've learned from 34 years of adapting this program and seeing how it works in different contexts is going back again to that idea of relationship-based work, but really meeting the parents where they are and doing the skill building, the knowledge building, strengthening support networks, but then really zooming in on what we call looking back and moving forward. Because the research has shown that it's not so much how you were treated as a child that shapes the way you parent your child, but it's how you've come to think about it. And we can't change how a parent was treated in their childhood, but we can definitely change how they've come to think about it. And so we encourage them to think in very concrete terms about what happened to them when they were reaching out for comfort. What happened? What did they get from their parents or from other caregivers? What happened when they misbehaved? How were they treated? How were they understood or not understood? And to face the pain of that, to be able to come to some grips with the pain of that. A second part of that is to recognize how it still affects you. Now I'm going to share just a teeny bit of my own experience here because I've really learned a lot through my own journey as a mom and a former child. My parents were teenagers. My dad dropped out of school after 9th grade. And he came from a family where there was a great deal of mental illness. My grandfather and my great-grandfather both committed suicide, both had very serious bipolar disorder, what was then called manic depression. And there was a lot of maltreatment in that larger family. And I experienced some of that in my own life. And in particular, my dad had a very explosive temper. He was kind of obsessive compulsive, and if things got a little out of whack, he could just blow up. And I was walking on eggshells all the time, thinking, am I going to trigger him? And I did not want to repeat that kind of behavior. There were other things I experienced too, but my story is not the point here. I just want to illustrate why it's important to think about this. So I did not want to repeat what my father did to me. And I have a PhD in developmental psychology, and I know a lot about parent-child relationships. But guess what? When I was a young mom, and my husband was busy building his career and was working around the clock, and I was exhausted because my child had been crying all day, had some kind of colic or something going on, and I was just totally frazzled. I found my father's behavior coming up in me. I felt his facial expressions on my face. I heard his voice coming out of my mouth. And still to this day, even with my grandchildren, who I love more than life itself, if they really push my buttons, sometimes I feel that bubbling up because that's what I learned. That was my first lesson in parenting when I was a little girl. And my mother was kind of passive, quite passive and submissive, and just stood by and didn't protect me from my father, so there was that dynamic. And I really had to come to grips with how that still affects me and then understand what I had to do to calm those impulses, to take a deep breath, to look my kids in the eye and say, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that. That was about me, not about you. And keep walking through that journey, which goes on and on. So face the pain, acknowledge its influence on you, and then choose what you want to repeat and what you want to leave behind. And this is really key. It's not something you do in a heartbeat. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of mindfulness. But I wanted to replicate my father's investment in my education. He told me when I was in kindergarten that I could be top of my class. Even though he did a lot of things wrong as a dad, he gave me a sense that I could get an education that he never had. So I was the first in my family to go to college. And I kept going. My family thought that was kind of crazy, but so, you know, we all look back and think about what it is that was good for us, even if our parents were not so great. And what do we definitely want to leave behind? And how can we muster all available resources to help us live out those choices? And that's the journey of breaking the intergenerational cycle. It's very easy to talk about. It's very hard to do, but it's not impossible by any means. And if we're well-trained professionals who know how to really share that journey, not just tell somebody what they better do, but really share that journey with them and acknowledge that we all have to live that journey. Not just the people who are coming to the attention of child protection, but all of us in our intimate relationships have some kind of that journey to walk. And so really doing that from a relationship-based perspective makes a huge difference. So face the pain, acknowledge its influence on you, and then choose what you want to repeat and what you want to leave behind. So if you don't mind, I would like to kind of wrap up my comments by just sharing something that has to do with a baby boy who came to my attention quite a few years ago when I was doing this work in the community. He was 7 months old when he was having seizures at home and was taken to Hennepin County Medical Center to be treated. And it turned out that his young father had shaken him because he wouldn't stop crying. And that's what triggered the seizures. And the healthcare providers who examined this little boy also discovered that when he was probably about 4 months old, his legs had been broken because, as it turned out, the father confessed, the baby wouldn't hold still to have his diaper changed. And so the father twisted his legs and caused fractures that had healed without treatment. And Rich, you know many stories like this, but this little boy, Jeffrey, really, his story really touched my heart. And it was a heartbreaking story, obviously, but his young parents touched my heart too, because both of them were very young. They both had a history of significant maltreatment in their own childhoods. And just a short while ago, they had been children in the child protection system themselves. And if you look at most abusive parents, that's the case. Whether they came to the attention and had any kind of intervention or not, we don't know always, but having the capacity to abuse your own child, you almost surely experience some kind of maltreatment in your childhood. And so here were these young parents who didn't know anything about infant development. The father had very poor anger management, really just didn't know what to do with his frustration when the baby wouldn't do what he wanted him to do. And the mother was so eager to have this young man, boy really, care for her that she wouldn't stand up to him, and she stood by and let him do the things he did to Jeffrey. So we had a combination of very overt physical abuse and chronic emotional neglect on the part of both parents, and the mother allowing that and inflicting it herself. So I was inspired to write a song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but I'd like to just read the lyrics because I was trying to capture what Jeffrey's experience must have been like for him. And we can never completely put ourselves into the shoes of a little baby in that kind of situation, but this was my effort. And I would ask you just to put yourself in that situation, maybe just close your eyes and just think about what this little boy is experiencing. And the song asks a very important question. The small boy reaches out for the love that he needs, but his bid for attention no one will heed. So he begins to cry, hoping someone will hear, but as no one responds, his heart fills with fear. Alone in his room with no one in sight, he cries louder and stronger out of sadness and fright, until finally his father's standing over his bed. But then the arms that should hold him reach out and shake him instead. If he's living such pain at the hands of his father, how will he ever learn to love? The small boy reaches out for the love we all need, but his bids for attention no one ever will heed. So he ceases to cry, and hope melts away as no one responds to him day after day. Alone in his room with no one in sight, he hardly can tell if it's day or it's night. And he prays that his father won't come near his bed. His heart feels like stone as his hope turns to dread. If he's living such pain at the hands of his parents, how will he ever learn to love? And I would say to all of you who are listening, we are the answer to that question. How will he ever learn to love?